Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tafwai. Far right, extreme right, or radical right? What's in a label? Or how about al-Qaeda, or Islamist, or jihad? The terminology should be irrelevant when the end result is death. Yet, we're accustomed to labels, and the case of Norway's anti-Islam terrorist Breivik, responsible for the deaths of 76 people, who is still not referred to as a terrorist by much of the media, is no exception. In this news analysis, we will examine this profiling label, especially in the media, and whether this incident will change the typical outlook on the common terrorist, which is so often associated with Muslims.
Europe continues to mourn the loss of life following the recent deadly attacks in Norway. In the capital of the European Union, Brussels, citizens have been visiting the Norwegian embassy to offer their condolences.
A lot of Europeans like me feel really shocked by what happened in Norway, and because it's one of the countries where values as democracy are very highly appreciated.
What fueled the attacks were the gunman's extremist Islamophobic and anti-immigrant views, which he expressed in an online manifesto.
I think that things like that, this crisis like this, will help people become again aware that we are all human beings and we should not kill each other. So I'm just an optimist, and I don't want killing of any kind, of Muslims or non-Muslims, of Christians or anyone.
The victims of the massacre were Norwegian civilians.
The Oslo attack was one of the worst mass killings in the history of Europe since World War II. At least 76 people were murdered. The gunman has been charged with acts of terrorism.
Meanwhile, observers point out that the far-right beliefs held by the attacker have actually been on the rise throughout Europe.
Islamophobic and anti-immigrant sentiment has been prevailing and has been increasingly pervasive recently. This is a common symptom of financial decline, that there's a group that's going to be scapegoated and criticized and blamed for lack of jobs or taking away jobs, relying too much on the social welfare system, etc. And this seems to be an opportunity for governments to curb their racist and xenophobic language that's commonly used to be re-elected.
Recently, Germany's Chancellor and Britain's Prime Minister famously remarked that multiculturalism has failed. Observers say such statements could serve as a disincentive to integration, placing the onus exclusively on the migrants.
There's an implication that migrants are not doing their part to acclimate, to assimilate, to become European, to become German or to become British or whatever. And I think there needs to be a focus on the structures in place that prevent them from wanting to be more involved.
Analysts say migrants tend to face institutional obstacles to services, employment and housing, and they often lack certain legal rights. Yildiz Sadakova, Press TV, Brussels.
Well, let me welcome our guest to this edition of Press TV News Analysis. We have spokesperson from the Islamic Human Rights Commission representing IHRC, Ahmaduddin, who joins us from London. From Peace Through Justice, Mari Salahan, joining us from Washington. And we have former CIA officer joining us from Washington, also Philip Giraldi, who joins us on the phone. I'd like to welcome all our guests to this edition of Press TV News Analysis. Philip Giraldi, basically a terrorist and a killer. That's how Breivik should be described. Why is the media skirting around the issue with other labels?
Yeah, basically, at least in the United States, has an agenda which is to categorize different types of terrorism. And basically, they see international terrorism as an Islamic phenomenon, and they like to put other labels on what they see as domestic terrorism, or as they refer to it here in the United States, homegrown terrorism. But, you know, this is all a fiction, basically. What these people who kill other people are doing, this is a criminal act. Terrorism is only a tactic, and terrorism is something that's used by very diverse groups and very diverse interests. So it's an attempt to label something in a way that misleads the listener in terms of what the objective is.
And of course, we could look at how a print does it. And even before news gets to the print, Ahmaduddin, almost all the news comes from wires. I'm sure you're familiar with APTN, Reuters, AFP, etc. Looking at just some of the terms: Islamist attacks, moderate Islam, radical Islam, or jihadists, just some of the adjectives that are used, and nouns. Isn't this how people's psyche in the first place has been shaped and their minds conditioned? And before you respond, well, let's take a look at what the British daily The Sun wrote one day after the terrorist attack in Norway. So there you have the title there, and you can see right below that how it made a reference to Al-Ghade as it being a massacre perhaps related to that. And of course you have the following description in terms of the details that have come out. So the print has come out referring to it, associating it with Al-Ghade. Let me have your response to that, Ahmeduddin.
You would think that after the scandal that's happened in the Rupert Murdoch's media empire, that they would learn the lesson, not to jump to conclusions. Straight away, as you've shown, one of the headlines, putting the blame on Muslims, and what the media has essentially done is that any acts of terrorism or violence that takes place, people are automatically assume that it was done by Muslims. Even Muslims themselves are so scared that if an act of terrorism is taking place, they're like, oh, please, let not this be a Muslim act. Because they know as soon as this act is carried out, and if it's blamed on the Muslims, a new government legislation will come through, will discriminate the whole of the community and label them as potential terrorists. And, the irony is that if you look at Europol's statistics, in 2006, for example, out of 500 terrorist attacks, only one of them was labeled Islamist. In 2007, almost 600 terrorist attacks, only 4 of them were classed as carried out by Islamists. That's less than 1% of the figure. And the media seems to be kind of using that as a means to kind of discriminate against the Muslims. Now, in a recent, we carried out a anti-Muslim hate crime questionnaire at the Islamic Human Rights Commission, and we found out from the statistics that around 70% of people responded said that they feel the media is negatively stereotyping Muslims negatively.
Right. Well, let's look at how the U.S. President Barack Obama, Mari Salahan, reacted within hours after this attack took place in Norway. Basically, Barack Obama immediately, practically hours after the attack, made insinuations that it was an Islamic connection there, and at the same time was attempting to justify America's war on terror. Your reaction to that reaction by the U.S. President?
Okay, unfortunately, I didn't hear the feed, but what I do know is this. We have in the United States and in the rest of the Western world, certainly, and in other parts of the world as well, we have a situation where propaganda is being used as an instrument of war, both propaganda and law, domestic law within these countries and international law as it pertains to the UN and certain international covenants that most of the nations of the earth are signatories to. These are being used as weapons of war. I wrote a piece of commentary shortly after this tragedy in Norway that touched upon my experience in Oklahoma City in the mid-90s after the federal center there was bombed, and it was initially blamed on Muslims. The terrorist act was initially attributed to Muslims, only later to be found out that it was in fact a red-blooded American, non-Muslim, a Christian ex-soldier who was guilty of that attack. And even after, unfortunately, this became known, there were still reverberations, ugly reverberations that were felt by the Muslim community in and around Oklahoma City. I went there on a fact-finding visit. And, you know, recalling that in the aftermath of this tragedy in Norway, I wondered if something similar might happen in Norway and in other parts of Europe as a result of this act of terrorism that was committed by a Christian, self-identified Christian.
Okay, if you have my voice, why is it then that you have a case, Maury Salahan, where obviously this is not a Muslim man, a 32-year-old, and I hate to start putting labels, but white in terms of the profile altogether, which is far from what a Muslim person would be. But still, news and media are trying to somehow revert this back and associate it with Islam and Muslims. Why is that happening?
Because it's part of the propaganda campaign. Over the post 9/11 in the global community, there has been a very intensive drive to equate terrorism and terrorists with Islam and Muslims. And even though, as one of your guests pointed out, the vast majority of acts of terrorism in Europe have been committed by non-Muslims, probably European males, and in the United States of America, the same. The vast majority of terrorist attacks have been committed by white males in this country. But, you know, this is an inconvenient truth. Facts be damned. When it comes to the agenda of certain organizations, certain policymakers, certain corporate interests that operate from the shadows, who are profiting from this so-called war on terrorism and this need to defend national security. Again, facts be damned.
Right.
In order for this campaign of vilification and justification for what is essentially unjustified to continue, the image of this threat coming from a certain quarter of the global community's population has to be sustained.
Well,
that's what it's all about. It's a propaganda war, and it has to be sustained. The imagery that's been painted has to be sustained by any means necessary.
I'm going to take what you said about politicians and what you said about some of the perhaps corporations, and Philip Giraldi, ask you about the focus of some reports that, well, European politicians, they're saying they have mishandled the immigration debate vis-a-vis Muslims. Before I get a reaction from you, let's first take a listen to this clip.
But last fall, I said Europe is going to go into financial trouble, and it's also going to go into problems with radical Islam, because the cities are being overrun, and the cities are also, many of them, are being, for instance, in France, they are being, the Islamic towns, or whatever you call them, sections, are getting in to the middle management of all of France, and this is happening all over Europe. And they are squeezing the neck of Europe. And that's what Geert Wilders has been saying, that political correctness and multiculturalism is killing Europe. And he's right.
Philip Giraldi, your reaction.
My reaction is that basically immigration is a serious issue, both in the United States and in Europe. And it's an issue that is quite separate from what they're trying to do, which is to conflate the immigration issue with fears about immigration and turn that into a terrorism issue. There's no connection between the two. There's no connection between immigrant communities in Western Europe and radical Islam, apart from very, very small numbers, a very tiny minority. So this is conflating two fears together to create a greater fear. And I would also point out that, at least in the United States, most of the think tanks and most of the sources of Islamophobia are themselves very, very strong supporters of Israel. And this is something an issue that we should not avoid, that basically the demonization of Islam and of Muslims is essentially coming from a pool of so-called experts, most of whom are very closely allied to the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's a kind of situation where, well, what kind of product are you going to expect coming from these groups? But where the public hears nothing but this line of propaganda, at a certain point it begins to believe it. And that's really the unfortunate aspect of this.
Well, you say that it's two fears that's combined to create a greater fear to justify something?
That's right. It's a demonization of Islam and of Muslims in general. And the immigration issue, as I say, is a serious issue for every country to deal with, because immigration is something that arouses certain concerns about crime rates, about jobs. I mean, these are serious concerns. But the fact is, they are taking that, and they are something that should be dealt with in a rational way, and they're trying to conflate it with international terrorism.
Ahmaduddin, you heard that soundbite. Hopefully, that was Glenn Beck. Tell us first your reaction, and ultimately, who's more dangerous? What are the consequences of a personality coming out with statements like that?
See, the concept that the Muslims have been invading Europe over the last 50, 60 years or so, it's so stupid, the fact that Muslims have been in Europe for centuries. Okay. Europe is a product of Jews, Christians, Muslims, and people of all other faiths. They forget that when Europe was in a crisis where it needed migrant workers, they conveniently allowed Muslims to come into the country and work hard to build up the very nations they live in today. Now they don't need them, they want to get rid of them. Now, the perpetrator of the act in Norway, not only has he carried out a terrorist attack, but is a clear signal to groups like the EDL and Stop Islamification of Europe, saying that, look, we are with you, carry out these acts, and also is giving encouragement to politicians who are on the far right, encouragement to kind of be discriminatory towards Muslims. And we've seen this in various European nations. It has become the norm to pick on the issues of the hijab and the niqab and the radical Islam. And when you have prominent politicians, even the likes of David Cameron coming out saying that multiculturalism has failed, it's encouraging people who would have uttered these words against Muslims are coming out and saying that we don't want Muslims here and we want Muslims to act in a certain way. And if you look at the recent prevent agenda, it's the prevent agenda is trying to redefine and socially engineer Islam to the way of thinking of what they want Islam to be.
Maurice Halahan, in the United States, I'm sure you're aware recently about Republican Peter King's congressional hearing on terrorism and radicalization in the American Muslim community, in which he only focused on Muslims. When he was asked about other profiles, he said it's not worthy of examining. And of course, that created controversy because he said, well, they don't commit crimes as often. So basically, the conclusion that has been reached, is it that a terrorist act by a non-Muslim like Breivik is an isolated incident, but in a case it's Muslim, it's a systemic problem? Before I get your reaction to that, let's go to another clip, which I like first for you to listen to prior to getting a reaction from you.
We are all Muslims now. We have to understand that. We are all Muslims now. These prosecutions against Muslims are ideological prosecutions. The government is saying, we are uncomfortable with your ideology, we're going to take you down. And what they're doing with the peace activists is no different.
Blaming all Muslims before they even commit crimes. Your reaction to what you just heard?
I'm reminded of an observation that was made by the French philosopher Voltaire, who said, those who can make us believe absurdities can also cause us to commit atrocities. What's happening in America, and given the fact that I'm a human rights activists, and I visit courtrooms all over the country where young Muslims, primarily young men between the ages of 18 and 35, are in the dock for thought crimes. You know, these preemptive prosecutions, they're called. Oftentimes engineered by an informant or a provocateur on the payroll of the government. It's the fanaticism of the Becks and these other so-called right-wing conservatives or neocons or just plain opportunists who are in this. Yes, I believe in part for ideology, but I also believe that what they're primarily motivated by is money and this desire to be in the spotlight, to have 5 or 10 minutes or 1 hour of fame. It's all of this is being done at the expense of what America is supposed to stand for as the land of liberty and justice for all. And as someone born and raised in this country, as someone who loves this country, and who believes that the best way to demonstrate that love is by doing as much as you can to force, if necessary, your country to live up to the better part of itself. As someone that is deeply involved in this work, I am outraged by what I often hear coming over the airwaves. I'm outraged by what so many of our self-serving politicians have a knack for saying. I was present at the Peter King hearings for the first hearing, and it was a circus. It was a very shameful circus that did not reflect the better of the two Americas. And and so again, you know, in the work that we're striving to do, we're doing our best to put this country on the path that it's supposed to be on.
But I'm sorry to say there's some other personalities I'm going to add to the list, some which perhaps didn't come to your mind. Philip Giraldi, based on Breivik's manifesto, I don't know if you had a chance to review it, he was heavily influenced by American anti-Muslim activists, some of them. Neoconservative Frank Gaffney, a former Reagan official, a regular on Fox News, and another one, Brigitte Gabriel, a leading organizer of grassroots anti-Muslim activism, to have collaborated with the Tea Party movements in the United States. How much is the U.S. at fault here?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, the fact is that the American public has been fed one side of a story for a long time now, and has been fed a heavy dose of propaganda to support that story. And you know, when that's been going on for something like 30 or 40 years, it's very difficult to turn that around. And I believe that politicians like Obama and like Hillary Clinton, in particular of late, who have been tiptoeing around the issue of Islam and terrorism, while at the same time saying, "Oh no, we don't really believe that," they're leaving the same impression that they are out to change Muslim governments because Muslim governments are fundamentally wrong, and they're sending messages constantly that reinforce this stereotype of what Muslims are about.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Former CIA officer from Washington, Philip Giraldi, with his statements there. We also had a spokesperson of the Islamic Human Rights Commission, HRC, Ahmed Uddin from London, and from Peace Through Justice, Mauri Salahan. Thank you so much. His statements from Washington. I want to thank you, the viewer, for watching. Send us any questions or comments that you may have. Newsroom@presstv.ir. It's the old-fashioned way. That's our email address. From Miko Betahwe and the entire team, it's goodbye.